What's good, Baylor family? It's Monday, August 18th, and we are less than 2 weeks away from the start of the 2024 football season. What does that mean? Well, the team is going into shutdown mode with a mock game week this week. That means no media availabilities with players and coaches, just straight ball for them. But that doesn't change our plans, Grace and I's plans on Inside Baylor Sports, the official podcast of Baylor Athletics. Today, Grace and I will continue our position-by-position preview of this year's Baylor football team. Last week, we talked about the entire offensive unit from the quarterback down to the offensive line. Today, we're going to start with the defense by going in depth with the defensive line. But first, there's a pretty big event that happened on Saturday night at McLean Stadium with the second scrimmage fall camp for the team. Dave Aranda identified this as a very important scrimmage to determine a lot of things about, the starters, the depth chart, what the team is going to look like in terms of scheme, etc. And Grace and I had multiple conversations. We compiled some notes over on Sikkim 365. If you're not a premium member, we definitely encourage you to take advantage of the bundle that Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus are offering. For $17.99 a month, you get full access to both platforms, everything that you can imagine. And we want you over there, but we also want to give you a little bit of inside information here about what we heard about the scrimmage. So, Grayson, I want to start with you. You had a lot of notes, as did I, about what happened. But of what you heard, what bit of information stood out to you most about that second scrimmage at McLean Stadium on Saturday?
We were so hard on the offensive line last week. Just like the conversation we had about that group was just exactly what needed to be had at the time, because the first scrimmage did not go well for the offensive line. It didn't. It really hurt the entire offensive flow. Now, that happens a lot. I think you and I would agree. That first scrimmage, it almost always goes the defense's way. But in this case, it was really pretty lopsided. And so coming into this week, this was very important. I mean, this scrimmage was probably going to determine my confidence level in this offensive line, even being average. Like, they had to be good this weekend. I mean, they were. And the interesting part for me is, you got a lot of guys who I believe have kind of been locked in starters for a while, and they got the start this week. And it was kind of the group that we expected. When you look at Alvin Ebasele at left tackle, Ryan Lingiel at left guard, Colton Price at center, Omar Egbedian at right guard, and then Campbell Barrington at right tackle. That comprised the offensive line. That has been the starting offensive line since the spring. We've seen a lot of position battles take place. We've seen a lot of guys try to get into that starting rotation. But for the most part, that has been the five that has been locked in. And by all accounts, they had a really, really good weekend, especially in pass protection. That was the area where they really got a lot better from the first week. I felt like that was the biggest note of the week. I felt like that was kind of the thing that allows you to actually sit back and say, hey, this Baylor football team can make a bowl game this year.
Yeah, and I think that's, the threshold for this team is making the bowl game. We know that this group's going to have to lead the way. I mean, Dave Aranda has preached on it the last 2 years. In 22, they had a really strong unit coming back with multiple starters back from the championship team. Last year, they didn't. They added some transfer pieces, but they were very young. And so with this group, Mason Miller, the new offensive line coach, who's a veteran with offensive lines. I mean, he's been around the country doing it with Mike Leach before Mike Leach passed away and made his trip to Tarleton, believe it or not, who Baylor opened with in week 1. But you trust a guy like Mason Miller to get his best five. And I think the biggest takeaway from me is, like, man, you can talk about the transfers and hoping those guys come in, but there's a pretty good blend of that group that you just discussed, that there's some guys who started. There's a transfer that is starting. And then there's one guy in Ryan Lingiel who is kind of just emerging. And you want that from a guy who has been on campus. Now there's been some shakeup with the offensive scheme, and he's kind of flourishing. So you in a way, I can understand why people might be disappointed. Oh, there's not, transfers starting. We brought in all these guys and they're not making a push. But at the same time, a guy like Ryan Lingiel, I would say this time last year, he was is he going to be in the program much longer? And so in a lot of ways, he is a new guy, because I think he has benefited from this scheme, and he's older. He's going to be more physically strong than some of these younger guys who they might be relying on. And he's basically a fourth year junior. and he had his redshirt year, and now he's flourishing to a great extent. I don't want to speak on how good someone is going to be before we've ever seen them, but for him to be in that group over guys who have started elsewhere, who transferred in, I think is a pretty telling sign. Now that could change in the first couple of weeks of the season. Maybe someone else pushes him, but yeah, I think same for me. The run game, I don't know where that's going to end up. I think that there is still question marks with that, but also know that Baylor's defensive line, who we'll talk about today, there's excitement around there. So there's kind of a stalemate to an extent in the scrimmage, it sounds like, except in the passing game. And I think that's very encouraging in general. And what you mentioned this, and I want to ask you directly. You mentioned this in your notes about a backup who is kind of making his way as a transfer that could push. Give me a little more insight on that and what you heard in regards to this transfer.
Right. So South Carolina transfer Sidney Fugar, he was brought in the summer, so he hasn't been at Baylor very long. And so he's kind of had to adapt quickly. He also played a lot of tackle at South Carolina. So he's like really adapting to this new role of playing guard. But the thing that intrigues me a lot about him, and we might have mentioned this on the offensive line preview, but he's 341 pounds and he's 6'5". And Baylor does not have guys like that. And when you look at what Baylor tried to do in the transfer portal, almost immediately, they went out and they got Kurt Daniker, who is like a 335, 334-pound guy to anchor that guard spot. And unfortunately, Daniker unable to play, but I think Fugar is basically your real replacement for him. Like that kind of size, the kind of potential that you want, the kind of strength and power that you want up front is something that's really intriguing and something very unique to this entire Baylor roster on the offensive line. They just don't have a lot of guys like that on the interior. And so I think Fugar could really fill in that role. He's seemingly turning the corner. I think it took him a little bit, but I think in this last scrimmage, he really kind of put his name up there for being, if there's going to be another guard that comes in, if there's going to be a guard that replaces one of the starters, at this time, I think Sidney Fugar is the guy that could do that.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been talking about offensive line like at the end of last week. I feel like we've just kind of been on our mind. So I want to switch gears a little bit. If I stay on the offense and talk about the receivers, that in this particular scrimmage, I think while the running game maybe didn't get going, the passing game did. I mean, that was the immediate reactions was they were utilizing the entire field in the passing game. I mean, we can talk about tight ends, but it was truly about the receivers. They were utilizing the entire field, taking shots down the field, both the first and second team offenses. But it was really anchored by the receivers. And if whoever you talk to right now, they just talk about the depth of this group. And I think we have to always, before we start talking about how good this potential, I think it's all has to be relative of the entire offense and where they were last year to where they're potentially going to be this year in a new scheme. But this receivers group, I mean, it's deep and it's fast and it's talented. And I think that they're truly in spots now that they're going to be put in a position to succeed. And I think we saw that at the beginning or in this particular scrimmage. And, I don't want to harp on the old scheme, but these guys needed to be in a scheme like that. And they brought in two more. And so from you, what was the biggest takeaway personnel wise from this scrimmage at receiver for you?
Well, I mean, the first place is no Ketron Jackson. So he didn't play in this scrimmage. So that's obviously one kind of important piece of information because he is going to be a starter on the outside for this team. Aside from that, you kind of look around at the room and you go, okay, you feel like Ashton Hawkins is going to be a good player, which he showed on Saturday. Once again, he continues to make a lot of plays. I feel we both feel really good about him. That's not really surprising at all. Monterey Baldwin, didn't hear much about him from this game, but again, we know what we're getting from Monterey Baldwin. It's not really a question in my eyes. The question was for me, two guys, Hal Presley, Michael Trigg. What are you going to get from those guys? And I know Trigg is a tight end, but he's a pass catcher. He's a receiver. Yeah, it is what it is. And so Hal Presley had a very good scrimmage by everything that I heard. Contested catches, big plays down the sideline, a lot of different routes that he was running and winning on. Very important, I think, for this team because he does kind of when I look at this roster, he does look like someone that if he took a big step forward, this offense could jump just another level, because having another guy on the outside opposite Ketron is massive. So that was huge. And then Michael Trigg obviously was mentioned by Dave Aranda, singled out by Dave Aranda as a guy that's been performing really, really well.
Huge in my eyes, massive.
Oh, he doesn't do that. He hardly does that. And he was raving about Michael Trigg, which is great to hear because he's been dealing with some sort of nagging injury the last week, was doing third string stuff, and then shows up at this scrimmage and is playing first string snaps. And so that's big as well, because I do think he's also a massive wild card, because you could get zero production. And when I mean zero, like hardly playing at all production. To being a guy that I think could push for some sort of all-conference nomination if he plays enough snaps.
Follow Baylor Plus and Sikkim 365 today on X, Instagram, and Facebook, and sign up for the new premium content bundle. For the monthly price is $17.99, a $5 per month savings. Baylor fans can access the full offerings that both platforms offer: the long-form storytelling, video, and all-access behind-the-scenes content of Baylor Plus, and the premium news, analysis, and forums of Sikkim 365. Sign up today on either platform.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, leave a review, and tell your friends about us. Catch Colt and I on Inside Baylor Sports every weekday. You can also watch the video version free over at BaylorPlus.com or the official Baylor Athletics YouTube channel.
I think we look at this offense and we want there to be a running game, right? I think you say they have to have a running game to win. Okay, well, so let me just toss this out there. Jake Spavital has done it in a lot of different ways. Last year at Cal, he wanted to run the football because of his personnel. But if you look at his career, where the types of schemes he's running, I don't think he's going to shy away. I mean, you talk about Mason Miller running Mike Leach's offense. Like, I think we have this vision of we want them to run the football because that's what wins you games. Rightfully so. I think you can win a lot of games at a higher rate consistently if you can run the football well. But this is an air raid scheme at its core. And you have 6 guys plus a tight end who have the ability to produce. If Hal Presley's one of those, like you mentioned, that just emerges kind of to that next level, and Trigg do too, you kind of know what you're getting from other guys. And that's 6 receivers, pass catchers that can really hide issues at the running game in this particular scheme. And I don't think that's talked about enough. I don't want to just say it's okay not to run the football, because I don't believe that. But for a 1 year where you're trying to get to the postseason and continue down the path what you are with recruiting, with this particular staff, you want to mesh it well with Dave Aranda's defense. If that's what gets you to the bowl game, ride it. And right now, that's what it sounds like it's going to be. Now, Dominic Richardson, I want to hit on these injuries really quick. Dominic Richardson was out of the scrimmage. He did not play. He's been dealing with a hamstring injury. Ketron Jackson did not play. There might have been some other offensive guys who were limited, but those who are more than likely starters. So the offense was already hamstrung a little bit. Matt Jones on the defensive side of the ball was injured. But, man, going back to the offense, like, I don't know if we're not going to see this offense peak early in the season, because they're just at Tarleton State. Like, that's just going to be true game reps where they're just going. Right. And I think we're going to see the identity of this team. And it might not be what we want it to be, but it might be what Jake Spavital sees this is what it needs to be. And I think that's what excites me most, specifically about the receivers room and its depth.
I could definitely see that. And I mean, they are going to run the football. I want to be clear. They did run the football. It just was not as explosive as the passing game was, because there were probably 7 or 8 big plays in the passing game, like true explosive type plays. And so I think that takes away a lot of the shine from the dirty work the run game was doing, and especially the quarterback run game. There was a lot of that in the scrimmage as well. And so I think that's going to add another wrinkle. I'm not all that worried that they're going to run the ball some. They're not going to be a dominant rushing football team, I do not believe. I think that could be more reserved for the passing game. But this was definitely an encouraging sign that this offense is growing, that the offensive line is growing, and that Jake Spavital's vision for this offense is kind of taking shape.
Yeah. I mean, they got to move the football. However you can move the football, if it's heavy pass with runs sprinkled in, if you can figure out how to run the football, great. But at the end of the day, it's about figuring out how to move the football. The good news is that Finn apparently had a rushing touchdown in this game early on. That's going to be a threat. I think they're going to need to clean up some red zone stuff, but don't expect this juggernaut offense by any means. But comparatively to what we saw last year, I think you're going to see an offense that doesn't put the defense in such bad positions as often. And it's going to grow throughout the season. I think there's a lot of excitement for it. So switching to the other side of the ball real quick, secondary, I thought we finally got a stable view of what that unit looks like. Chatu Reed right now is a starter at corner opposite of Caden Jenkins. Devin Bobby and Carl Williams are actually the starters at safety, which is kind of the interesting piece in this. And then transfer Kendrick Simpkins at the star position looks to be the top 5, but I think we can stress that those guys are going to rotate. I mean, you play in the Big 12, there's a lot of spread offenses, a lot of guys who can get on the field depending on the situations. But it was good to see or hear about what that starting unit actually looked like. And I think the common theme in all of this is Carl Williams is just, he's emerging right now. All the offseason talk was about Caden Jenkins, but now another sophomore, true sophomore, is Carl Williams making his way. And, I don't want to say he's unseating Devin Lemire, but right now it looks like that's the case. I expect Devin to play a lot. So general thoughts on the secondary before we move along to our position preview.
I think a lot of this had to do with speed. And so I think you're just seeing with Carl, you're able to get more speed on the field. And so that definitely makes a lot of sense. Devin Bobby is a fast guy as well. And then you got Kendrick Simpkins playing star, who, when you watch his game, he is basically just a havoc creator. He's not great in coverage. He's not going to guard guys one-on-one at this really high level. So if you're thinking Jalen Petrie, it's not that in coverage, but what it is a guy that gets into the backfield relentlessly and can be a problem when you're blitzing him. And that's an area that Baylor wants to get better at. And I think what you saw in this game, and this is probably going to be something that we hit on a little bit with the defensive line, but I think the secondary is going to go as far as Baylor's pass rush takes them. I do not think that this group is going to be dominant if you're giving a quarterback all the time in the world to make plays. They're going to give up explosives. Right. Not many will, but that happened in this game. The defensive line and the pass rushers gave too much time. It allowed for explosive plays down the field. They got to be able to get after the quarterback. That was an emphasis by Dave Aranda. So I think for this unit, that's going to be really important. I'm encouraged by a few things about it. I like the depth. Tevin Williams and Snacks Johnson being your primary backups at cornerback. They're going to play a ton. I think Devin Lemire gives you another veteran presence in the secondary. So if guys aren't playing well, or if you're subbing in and out, Devin Lemire is still going to play a big role. And you also mentioned Carl Williams might move up to star in certain packages as well.
I think I think that's inevitable. You need third and 10. Like, you don't necessarily want Kendrick Simpkins out there if he's not a great in coverage. I will say with Kendrick, he did play a lot of deep safety positions at Western Kentucky. And I think that's kind of forgotten because he had 7 sacks or something last year as a senior. Now he's in his 6th year, but he's an interesting one because I think he's going to be physical against the run. And let me back up. He's different to me because Corey Gordon last year didn't have any experience in the Big 12 or playing high-level football in coverage. Bryson Jackson was transitioning from linebacker to this safety position. What Kendrick brings is someone who knows how to play safety and he's truly a good fit for that. So you're not playing with a guy that doesn't have any experience in coverage. And so I'm excited to see that, but absolutely Carl Williams is going to float down in a lot of different situations. Devin Lemire will come onto the field, and then corner is just going to rotate. I mean, they have so many guys there in my mind, maybe Caden Jenkins being the highest upside potentially, but overall that's just a good group. And you want to see that they have to grow. I mean, we're saying all this understanding that these guys have to get better from where they were last year. In your natural progression, I think you hope to see that. You hope to see these guys take a step forward. So, all right, we spent a lot of time on the scrimmage. I want to talk about – let me go back. I want to encourage you to go sign up to read the rest of our notes on Sikkim 365. There's a lot more there. We talk about this stuff at every position, not just the ones we discussed today. But now we're going to get into the defensive line. This kind of ties into the scrimmage because I think the defensive line was a strength in this game and has been kind of a strength maybe in a different type of way when you talk about the down linemen, than what people, it's not really flashy. But what they did in the scrimmage again, and they've kind of showed that they did not show last year at all during the season, was the ability to stand up against the run and be strong. What is the reason for their ability to stand up and be strong against the run so far in spring, knowing that we don't know everything about Baylor's offense yet?
Right. So it's tough to say for sure, but I do think some of the base areas where they've really gotten better are bringing in a Linus Noel, giving them a true nose tackle. That was huge. I think their overall athleticism across the defensive line has gotten a lot better as well. Getting Jackie Marshall back, having Brendan Bett be a sophomore instead of a freshman, Trey Wilson be a sophomore instead of a freshman. You're seeing kind of that natural progression. And I think with Trevin Maye, that was a guy who came in from Oregon last year and just kind of got lost in the shuffle. And I think people forget that he was a true defensive end at the beginning of his career. So he was still really trying to figure things out. Yeah. Yeah. So he kept growing, kept getting bigger. And now I think he's really asserted himself into, a fringe starting role. It's hard to really say who starts for this group because there's probably 7 guys that are truly starters are going to play borderline starter minutes. So that's a key part as well. So the depth, I think, is that other area where it's like, oh, that's why they're able to stand up against the run. They have all these different body types. They have all these different looks that they can throw at you. And guys are staying fresh. And that was just something they were not doing last year because they relied so heavily on true freshmen and then a few older guys that just did not quite reach their potential.
Yeah. And I think when we talk about the rush defense, and if you go back to Dave Aranda when he first got to Baylor, when he was at LSU or Wisconsin, like stopping the run kind of started with the defensive line just holding on, like being disruptive to an extent, but truly just holding on, letting the offensive line not progress to the second level, not to get hands on linebackers. They didn't have that last year, and not to a fault. They recruited guys. You talk about Jarrell Boykins and Trey Emery, who were going to be their nose tackles along with Cooper Lands last year in certain situations. Cooper kind of being that flex guy who could play inside or outside, and then he becomes your starting nose tackle at 200. He was probably playing at 270 pounds last year at nose tackle. We know what his listed weight was, but by the time you get to the end of the season, you're just not heavy. And TJ Franklin, less than 300 pounds. I don't know what he was playing at last year, but that was not his game. Gabe Hall was probably the closest to that level. You mentioned Trevin wasn't to that extent. Like they were playing guys who didn't really match physically because of the injuries at nose tackle and everybody kind of having to slide down that they have this year. And we can talk about Big E. He's 300 and at least 330 pounds, probably closer to 340, playing nose tackle. You talk to people about him. He kind of looks like a regular guy, but then you watch him play and you're like, 1, he can move. 2, he can be a plug if you need him to be. And that's probably how he's going to traditionally play. And he can just eat up space. Dave Aranda mentioned him last night in the media session, on Saturday night in the media session. Just if you don't double him, he can be disruptive. If you're doubling him, he's going to eat up blockers. So it's kind of a two-pronged sword, right? You want to double him, but if you do, he's going to take on the double pretty efficiently as well. And then you look at the guys around him. Jackie Marshall being 295 pounds, Trey Wilson being up over 290. You mentioned Trevin pushing 300. I think he's over 300 now.
Yeah. That is 300.
Yeah, so Bet's 300. I mean, the girth on this defensive line is much different than it was a year ago, and I think that transitions to stopping the run, and it's going to have to this season. Like I know that Baylor's offensive line has struggled, but this group just being physically bigger and older is a big thing for stopping the run.
It definitely is. And I do think that is a focal point. Obviously, bringing in a guy like Linus Noel, you're definitely making a concerted effort to stop the run. But I will also say something that you and I have texted about a lot. Because of the different body types they have up front, it allows them to actually play very aggressive as well. When they're not necessarily just trying to stop the run, when you can go out there and say, okay, we're going to play Jackie Marshall, Trey Wilson, Cooper Lands, and an edge. They're all pass rushers. And so then it becomes a numbers problem for the offensive line. And it also allows Baylor to not necessarily have to blitz guys if they don't want to. They can bring guys from different angles, drop guys into coverage, really surprise an offensive line when you're having to deal with, 4 guys that can get after the quarterback. I think that's also going to be something that's huge for them this year. We've talked about them maybe just putting 2 defensive linemen and 2 jacks out there. And potentially 2 of those defensive linemen are just going to be Jackie Marshall and Cooper Lands, guys who can get after the quarterback. And that's really intriguing to me as well.
Yeah. I think the way that group has been recruited, and you throw in transfers, but overall, man, like this staff has actually, in credit to Dennis Johnson to an extent, who's now with the Baltimore Ravens, they've done a good job. And we haven't talked about Alex Foster, a 4-star high school kid that came in that had offered, it was kind of between Baylor and Texas there at the end of his recruitment, even though he's committed to Baylor. And he's a guy that we don't even have to really talk about yet. And that's, the depth on the defensive line is strong. And you want someone to emerge as, maybe a James Lynch. You want someone to emerge as a playmaker for the defensive line. I don't know if that particular group, the way that they're going to be asked to play, that we see someone just explode onto the scene for massive stats and catching the eyes nationally. I don't think we're going to see that, but this group can be a force in terms of stopping the run. And I go back to that. I think they can do other things potentially, but if they can stop the run, if we're talking about getting to a bowl game, stop the run. Figure out how to stop the run where your secondary is not, coming up and making Matt Jones and Keaton Thomas aren't having to worry about cleaning up everything that you do wrong or miss everything that you've messed up on. I say that really tongue in cheek, but like everything that's not going well, you don't want your linebackers cleaning it up. So I'm excited about this group. I do think Big E's the kind of the key to it. But as you mentioned, Cooper Lands playing nose tackle in pass rush situations can be big. And everyone behind him has to play well as well. So any final thoughts on that group and where they're going heading into the season?
I think just one thing I wanted to mention, you mentioned there's not going to be a James Lynch. There's not going to be a guy that has, tons of sacks, double-digit sacks this year. I fully agree with that. And that's not really Dave Aranda's track record. And I think the way they're building this unit, it is first and foremost, stop the run. Secondly, be guys who can win one-on-one battles when they're given those opportunities. And then third, taking up blockers so that the linebackers can get into the backfield and really wreak some havoc, because that's been a staple in Dave Aranda's defenses.
Yeah. And that's what you see. You bring in a guy like Keaton Thomas that's going to play behind him. We're going to get more into the linebackers in the next several days. But
I was told,
what they do.
I was told during the scrimmage, he's a missile. So that just gives you an idea of kind of what he's bringing.
We're like getting into this now, but like, so I watched them once, and we don't see a ton at practice. We get our 20-minute windows is usually, but they had the tackling sled, which I don't know if that's the official name for it. And I'm there with Andrew, my 7-year-old, and Andrew's watching like intently because like they're tackling this huge, steel frame thing with pads on it. He's just like mesmerized by it. And he's like, "What is that thing?" And I'm like, "That's called a tackling sled, I think." Anyway, so they're tackling, and Keaton goes and hits, and like, but I'm talking like these things are big and heavy, and you have a coach standing on the back of it, and he goes and hits it. And I'm talking in 5-yard span, he seems like he's running 100 miles an hour, no fear, and then leans over and tackles it. And, the look on my face is the same as Andrew's face. Like, what the heck just happened? Like, how did he do that? But that's him. Like that, you have a guy that has a playmaking ability. He started as a safety at West Virginia. Now he's playing linebacker at Baylor. Those are the guys that this defensive line is trying to free up. Matt Jones had 11 tackles for loss last year, kind of flying under the radar. But if this defensive line can be better in front of him, he's going to be a little bit better. So I would say just like the offensive line. And
Simpkins as well is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah. So, well, Baylor family, great episode. Got to recap a scrimmage for you, talk about the defensive line. Grace and I have really enjoyed doing this. The next 4 days are going to be talking about defense. We're going to continue to dive into it. No media availability. So it's just going to be kind of us working through this. There'll be another walkthrough on Friday, a small brief setting at McLean for the team on Saturday. Probably no physical contact or anything like that, but then it's game week. So we're excited to bring you up to that, to begin talking about opponents and wins and losses and everything that comes with it. And we encourage you to go and subscribe to Inside Baylor Sports on all of your podcast feeds, wherever you would find a podcast. Go there, find us, listen to us, get the notifications, find us on YouTube, the official Baylor Athletics YouTube page. And we're super excited to bring you up to the season, and we've had a great time. And we look forward to talking to you on Tuesday. And I think we're looking at the linebackers then. So great visiting with you. Talk to y'all soon, and Sick 'em Bears.